In 1938, 2 years before his death, John Buchan sat for the famous portrait photographer Youssef Karsh. Today, this one severe image and one exciting story, the 39 Steps, are all that most people would recognize of Buchan. Yet he was one of the most celebrated men of his time. From a modest Scottish Presbyterian background, he rose to be Governor-General of Canada. Alongside his public career, he produced a staggering range of books: biographies, short stories, poetry, historical and supernatural novels, which went well beyond the thriller.
People are often surprised when I tell them that he wrote a great many more books than that, and some better. They won't have that.
But it's for the thrillers that Buchan is remembered, and at their heart is an enigma. The figure of the austere, dutiful public servant who inspired a century of British spy fiction.
I mean, on the surface, there's an incompatibility, isn't there, between Buchan, the very uptight, hard-working, quiet, personally rather unassuming Scot, and the secret agent character Richard Hannay.
John Buchan was born in 1875 in Perth, where his father was a Free Church minister. The family soon moved to Fife and then Glasgow.
He himself, in his memoirs, said he grew up with a very, very powerful sense of sin. You know, and the sin isn't out there, it's within. And just beneath the surface of Buchan is this sense of sin.
The person who instilled this sense was not Buchan's father, a dreamy, reflective man, but his mother, Helen. She wanted John to go into the church. But even then, the young Buchan was caught between scholarship and adventure.
Father's parish is a very poor district, and Buchan teaches in the Sunday school. At the same time, the summer holidays are spent in Tweeddale, running almost wild, playing war games with his brothers.
The great place of refuge for Buchan, I think really right through his life, is the Borders, is the security of this maternal family home with an extended family of cousins. He's able to relax there in a way he perhaps can't at home. One could say that the cities reflect a more corrupt lifestyle. There's menace in the cities, whereas there's almost a self-renewing element in the country. And I suppose everyone is equal in nature.
Wood, sea and hill were the intimacies of my childhood, and they've never lost their spell for me. But the spell of each was different. The woods and beaches were always foreign places, in which I was at best a sojourner. But the border hills were my own possession, a countryside in which my roots went deep.
You cannot read Buchan without being able to smell the heather, without being able to feel your feet going into a peat bog. You just can't do it. I mean, the descriptions of Scotland, the chases that take place over its moorland, the panting uphill, people riding horses across the moors and coming upon remote houses, all this sort of thing. Buchan knew. I mean, Buchan did.
In the 39 Steps, there's a passage which I read when I'm lecturing as an illustration of how to do descriptions of landscape. I sat down on the very crest of the pass and took stock of my position. To left and right were round-shouldered green hills as smooth as pancakes, but to the south there was a glimpse of high, heathery mountains. In the meadows below the road, half a mile back, a cottage smoked, but it was the only sign of human life. Otherwise, there was only the calling of plovers and the tinkling of little streams. There was no cover for a tomtit in those bald green places.
Buchan's Scottish roots and love of its countryside would always mark him, however high he rose.
Everyone sees him as a consummate insider, a member of the establishment. I see him writing more about moorland heroes than clubland heroes. He was always an outsider. He was the Scotsman in England.
Buchan was no public schoolboy. His parents couldn't afford that. But he did win a scholarship to Hutcheson's Grammar School in Glasgow. Then a further scholarship took him to Glasgow University.
He's obviously bright kid from a lower middle class background. But in those days, university was the place where those bright kids acquired the polish that they needed if they were actually going to enter the establishment.
Glasgow University, he worked very hard indeed. I mean, one of the things about Buchan is that, you know, work is good. That's part of the thing. You've got to justify your existence. Work is good.
In 1895, Buchan, now aged 20, won a third scholarship to Brasenose College, Oxford, the final staging post for the grammar school boy on the make. He was introduced to a circle of aristocratic friends who would shape his career. Among them, Raymond Asquith, the brilliant son of the future Prime Minister, the poet Hilaire Belloc, and the adventurer Aubrey Herbert.
He fell in love with Oxford and, in a sense, probably with the English upper classes as well.
But what one's struck by is these are all high achievers, and they're all-rounders. They're people who get firsts, who play for the university rugby team or box the university. So these heroes that he creates later on are actually the people he's met at Oxford. It's not something that comes out of his imagination.
Buchan's friends were wealthy. He was not. There was no rich father to pay his bills.
Buchan had to earn money. He published 5 books while he was an undergraduate. Quite remarkable. So, in a sense, of course, this confirmed him in the belief that, you know, of his abilities. The fact that he could support himself, he could live on equal terms with these people.
While at Oxford, Buchan drew up this extraordinary list of honours already gained and to be gained. He could already cross off collections of essays, the Newdigate Prize for English verse, and novels like John Burnet of Barnes. To come were further prizes, and books he already had in mind. By the time he left Oxford, aged 24, Buchan had even secured an entry in Who's Who. Under occupation, his entry read, simply, undergraduate. In 1901, Buchan left Britain for the first time. The Boer War in South Africa had been raging for almost 2 years, as the independent Boer republics refused to submit to British colonial rule. The guerrilla tactics employed by the Boers had proved devastatingly effective. But by 1901, the British had recovered, and the war was all but over. Buchan was introduced by an Oxford contact to Lord Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa, who offered him a job as his private secretary.
Well, he was put in as one of a group, the Milner Kindergartens, they were known, to clean up the place after the mess that among them Milner had got into after the war with the Boers, which of course was one that greatly humiliated the British.
Buchan was brought face to face with the brutality of the Boer War.
There had been the appalling business of the concentration camps, in which Boer women and children were literally concentrated, but sanitation collapsed. That's the thing. There was an appalling death rate. About 20,000 died.
Despite these horrors, Buchan fell in love with South Africa, both the people and the landscape.
Once in a poem, a dedicatory poem in one of the books, he speaks of the fairest country under the stars, and that was South Africa.
Many of his characters are South African, like Peter Pienaar and Richard Hannay. That's very interesting that they are these outsiders. They're not members of the British establishment.
In South Africa, Buchan started writing what would become his first truly successful novel, Prester John. The story tells of a young Scottish man, David Crawford, who struggles to prevent an educated and charismatic black man, John Laputa, from leading an indigenous revolt.
Prester John's a very ambiguous novel. It's the chief literary coming of his South African experiences. Prester John, however, is a novel which does seem to look forward to a black Africa. And ultimately, the figure of John Laputa is a heroic figure. He's even given the last lines of Antony, in Antony of Cleopatra, and Cleopatra when he dies.
Unarm, Eros. The long day's task is done.
While in his fiction, Buchan allowed himself to articulate the African desire for independence, he himself had no doubts of the white man's role.
I think his experience in the Boer War gave him a very strong commitment to empire. I mean, he was a great imperialist, was Buchan. And that suffuses all his novels. I mean, Richard Hannay himself has an imperial background. After all, Richard Hannay had spent his youth in South Africa.
I mean, John Buchan wrote, when Britain, though not quite at the top and beginning to go downhill, still felt itself at the top, and where people like Buchan, deadly serious in their hearts, thought that that was where we deserved to be, provided we behaved according to certain rules. And this comes through in the stories, comes through in his political life. It was part of him. He was a deeply serious, patriotic man at a time when Britain was quite different from what it is today.
If Buchan's time in Africa had inspired him, it also disturbed him. His experiences of the Boer War alerted him to the growing fault lines in the old order, which would provide an important motif in his thrillers.
I think that he felt this was an example of the enemy within, that although the British population of South Africa, the English-speaking population, was quite large, there was another substantial section of the community there, namely the Dutch-speaking one, who did not hold the same loyalties, although they lived in South Africa, did not hold the same loyalties as the English-speaking sections.
After his 2-year adventure in South Africa, Buchan returned home, keen to put down roots. Characteristically, he wasted little time in doing so. He was invited by Tommy Nelson, an Oxford friend, to join the family publishing firm. And he married into the aristocracy, his bride, Susan Grosvenor, a cousin of the Duke of Westminster. There were soon 2 children, Alice, born in 1908, and John, born in 1911. While Buchan cemented his place in the English establishment, Europe was beginning to fracture, mirroring the cracks within empire which Buchan had observed firsthand in South Africa. The ugly clashes within old and new worlds brought new protagonists who began to ignite Buchan's imagination.
Really, at the beginning of the 20th century, people are becoming aware of spies and espionage. They really make their first appearance in invasion novels, which was a genre of novel which took hold in Britain after the Franco-Prussian War and with the rise of Germany.